Well, everyone, it's time for us to go and take a look at the iPhone 11 Pro and see how this particular iPhone holds up in 2025. Now, the big thing I can definitely tell you about the iPhone 11 Pro is that this is still in a lot of ways a really interesting, good device. I think Apple did a pretty good job with this device when it first came out, and I still think in a lot of ways this device is still a very good phone, but in some other ways, they may not be like the best performing device of all time, and we'll take a look at that throughout this whole entire video. First things first though, if you want to pick up this iPhone or some other iPhones that I would recommend buying this year, links will be down in the description below. You can get them from there and you can help support the channel at the exact same time. Now, starting off with the outside of this particular iPhone, you can see that on the front side, basically all around this particular device, it still looks like a pretty nice, iPhone. I think this thing still holds up fairly well in a lot of different ways. Number one, within this particular device, you are basically getting an iPhone that is giving you a 5.8-inch Super Retina XDR OLED display. So this is actually a pretty good display size to have inside of this phone. I think it looks pretty good. And there isn't really like too many things to really complain about here within this type of panel. It's not a perfect panel, as you can tell, like there's definitely some small little tiny issues going on with it. But I would probably tell you, if you are going to go through and like pick up an iPhone, this thing isn't terrible either. And I really do appreciate getting an iPhone like this because this panel itself is still pretty good. You're still maintaining things like a notch up top. You're still getting Face ID inside of this phone too, which I think is still a nice touch. And I still think if you're going to go through and pick up a device, this thing does kind of hold up pretty well when it kind of comes down to it. So from that side on the exterior, I definitely want you to kind of think about this device being that good because it still is a pretty good device when it comes down to it. On the bottom, you're getting a Lightning port, which is still fine, good enough for the most part. A little bit of like this curved side to it, which I actually like too, but the flat sides are definitely way more modern. You're getting a frosted glass back in the back of this thing, which can be a nice thing to basically get if you're somebody who wants to go through and like pick up one of these newer types of devices. Well, you can go through and pick up an older iPhone like this and still get some really good capability when it comes down to the whole entire, the way it holds up and, the feeling of it. Frosted glass back, triple camera setup, wireless charging. It's like a really good phone. I still think this phone holds up fairly well from the exterior, but I would definitely tell you there's definitely some ways that this phone maybe ages itself a little bit. Number one, this phone is definitely a little bit older considering that, it only has a 60 hertz panel and it isn't really giving you like a 120 hertz display. That right there can be a pretty big downside depending on which way you're looking at it. So depending on what type of phone you're getting, that could be very well a really big downside depending on which way you're going. So that right there is one thing to kind of keep in mind there. Now, on top of that, one other thing to keep in mind here too is the fact that this panel itself doesn't really get that bright. It still has a notch, so it's not, that new compared to like the phones that don't have notches. But on top of that, probably the biggest thing, one of my favorite things that newer iPhones have is a USB Type-C port. This iPhone is still giving you a Lightning port. So that right there, again, can be a really big downside depending on what you're kind of looking at. And if that is a really big downside for you, well, then there might be other devices out there in the market that might be better for you than this particular device. So at least from the exterior, that kind of covers it up there. From the price tag side, this phone is giving you a price of about $200 and something in the used market, less than $300. So that could be a pretty good competitive price to think about when you're picking up a phone, because this was just a $1,000 phone just a couple of years ago. This thing came out in 2019, so 6 years ago actually. That's quite a bit of time ago, but still. That long ago, this phone was holding up that well, and now it's starting to show its age a little bit, but that price tag is still up there. It's still a really good price to pay for a device like this, but is it worth buying, all things considered? Well, let's talk about the camera now. This thing is giving you a triple camera setup on the backside, so it's a 12 megapixel wide, 12 megapixel telephoto, then a 12 megapixel ultra-wide camera. And here's the thing about a camera like this, right, is that for the most part, this type of sensor and this type of camera, it's still going to be giving you like a pretty interesting type of camera layout. Like, it's not a terrible camera by any means at all. And that's the thing to keep in mind about these types of sensors, is that if you're going to go through and like pick up an iPhone camera, this thing's not really going to be that bad. So I do think this in and of itself is also one of those key areas to kind of think about, is that if you are going to go through and pick up an iPhone, this thing is not going to be that bad of a performing camera. There's definitely been worse performing cameras in this thing. But I would probably tell you that once again, if you're in the market and you're going to go through and like pick up a device, it might make a lot more sense to go and buy something that will give you a better camera. Having 4K at 60 on the front and the back is still really nice to have, but it would be kind of nicer to have a little bit of a better camera, right? Having 4K at 120, or, this one, it wasn't necessarily the worst camera of that year, but it definitely wasn't the best one either. So that's kind of the situation that we're in. And I do think there are probably better devices to go and pick up than this thing, even from the used iPhone perspective. So it's not a terrible iPhone by any means, it's not a bad iPhone at all, but just keep in mind that there are probably better devices out there to go and pick up than this particular iPhone from the camera side, but this thing is not really that bad either. So that covers it up there. When it comes down to the whole entire software longevity side, this iPhone is still supported with software, and it's probably going to be supported with software for quite a bit of time, right? So it's not really going anywhere anytime soon. So luckily for you, if you are going to go through and like pick up a device, you're probably still going to be getting like you're still going to be getting software support probably for another 2 years. So that could be a really nice thing depending on which way you're looking at it, right? So that is in and of itself one of those big things to keep in mind there. But as I mentioned before, there are probably some other devices that might make a little bit more sense to go and pick up. And this is the thing, right? If you're going to go through and pick up an iPhone, like I said before, there's better devices to go and pick up. And within this type of device, you're in one of these types of situations where these types of iPhones, they're just not really going to be lasting that much longer. Like they're still supported and everything, but they're not going to be lasting for an insane long amount of time. So you might be better, like in a better situation if you just go through and pick up an iPhone that is going to be giving you a longer software support. Maybe something like an iPhone 12 Pro, maybe an iPhone 13 Pro, that one will definitely be better. So think about those particular phones. That's kind of how I see it. Not trying to say that this is like a bad phone by any means, but there's definitely phones out there that will last way longer than this particular device. So once again, kind of keep that in mind there. Now, when it comes down to the performance, this iPhone is still giving you the Apple A13 Bionic chip inside of it with 4 gigabytes of RAM. And that is still a lot of, power to still have inside of a phone like this, right? Like, yes, this phone is a little bit outdated when it comes down to it, but it's not really like a terrible performing device. There's definitely been way worse performing devices than this thing. So I think that is kind of an important thing to keep in mind, that although this thing is definitely a little bit more dated, when it comes down to the whole entire capability of this phone, it's definitely not even that bad. And I definitely do think from the performance side, there's definitely way worse iPhones you can buy from a quality standpoint, from a feature standpoint, especially from a performance standpoint. But this thing's not really that bad, and I still enjoy having a phone like this when it comes down to it as well. So when it comes down to the performance, like I said, it's definitely not the worst performing device. There's definitely been really, really good performing iPhones when it comes down to it. And I do think if you are going to go through and pick up an iPhone, this thing's not really that bad either. So to kind of sum it up, what I can tell you is that with a device like this, right, I do think, in my personal opinion, an iPhone 11 Pro is still worth buying in some ways. I don't know if this would be like the first iPhone I'd recommend people to buy, but I think this would be an iPhone that if you're in the market and if you want to go and pick up an iPhone, this thing's not terrible, right? It's still a good iPhone. It still has a lot of capability and a lot of stuff going for it. I just don't know if this would be an iPhone that I'd recommend people to. This wouldn't be the first one, right? I think there's other iPhones that I recommend before this thing. I think an iPhone 14 Pro would be a really good iPhone to go and pick up. I think an iPhone 13 Pro would still be a really good upgrade coming from the iPhone 11 Pro. And those two iPhones would be the ones I'd recommend more so than, either of these things. So when it kind of comes down to it, that's kind of how I see it. This is not a terrible iPhone. This is not a bad iPhone by any means, but I just think there might be like better options out there than these particular devices. So in terms of that kind of covers it up there for the most part. If you have any other thoughts or questions, please let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.